Hi, this is Karen from Soterion, and you're listening to the SAP Security and GRC podcast, helping you on your journey to effective access risk management in SAP. In today's episode, we'll be discussing how organizations can achieve true business ownership of access risk. Our host is Emile Steyn, and he'll be joined by Mattison from Soterion. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast. Today, we will be speaking about one of the common challenges that companies experience, and also what are one of the business objectives that companies want to achieve in managing access, and that is to get business ownership of access risk. My name's Emile Steyn, and today I'm joined by Mattison. Cameron, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Emile. Hi, everyone. My name is Mattison. I work for Soterion Technologies, and I'm a senior authorizations consultant.
Thank you, Cameron. So, as I said, in today's topic, we are talking about mainly the business ownership of access risk, and we've seen a lot of organizations struggle to get business users to take ownership of access risk, and there are obviously many different reasons for that. But I think as a starting point, can you maybe give us a practical example of where we have seen a company struggling to get the business users to take ownership?
Yeah, definitely. So recently we engaged with the client on a SOD risk remediation exercise or project where the idea was to get the roles to a cleanest state as possible to align access on a user's day-to-day SAP responsibilities or activities that they need to perform. And what we found during this project is the key issue was a lack or incorrect people being identified to review the risk. So that boiled down to also business education. So identifying people is one thing, but also educating those users to make them understand or aware what their roles and responsibilities are in reviewing not just access, but also understanding the risks associated with the access assigned to their users. Not only was the business education an issue, but it also then boiled down to understanding of where risks cannot be remediated. The efficient controls or mitigation controls need to be put in place in order to make sure that those risks were mitigated. Now, the challenge that we faced with this client is they challenged the risk itself within the rule set, saying, but these users need to have the risk, so why are we even monitoring the risk to start off with? So the question I then posed to the client is to say, well, this risk may be acceptable for this particular department, whether it's finance, procurement, whatever the case may be. It might be acceptable for this user base. However, if users in a different department, the warehouse as an example, if they had this access, could this pose an impact to the business? And all of a sudden the eyes lit up and said, well, obviously this should not be assigned to those users. So there again, it boiled down to business education and understanding why this risk is a risk to your organization, not necessarily just focusing on a particular department, but look at the business as a whole. So that was a bit of a challenge in making the users understand why these risks are actually part of the rule set. And then obviously the no-brainer is these lead to adverse audit findings, which obviously poses its own challenges in itself. So during this little project, we found that the sort of key takeaways with this type of engagement is firstly identifying the correct people to perform these respective tasks, whether that's interpreting the rule sets, applying your mitigation controls, and ultimately business taking responsibility for their access risk, segregation of duties, and critical transactions.
Yeah, Cameron, that's I think very helpful. So I think it also takes us back to what we see is what is needed to implement an effective control, because having the correct people is one of those items. And as you rightly said, is sometimes you can have identify the correct people in your business, but it could still be needed that some education is required to get their knowledge and skills up to a standard where the control can actually be effective. I think so. One of the other components that play a part in that is also the process, design, and technology. So I think what we want to discuss is also just there are other areas where other processes potentially where we see companies struggle to take ownership. Can you maybe also give us an example or two of that?
Yeah, definitely. So if we look at it from a process perspective, we've also come across scenarios where clients or customers struggle with their user access reviews. So not only is it performing or the time it takes to perform those reviews, but also it's identifying the correct people to form part of that process. So we've often seen that a line manager is typically the person that the workflows or the periodic review, user access reviews are workflowed to. And these line managers might not necessarily have the understanding or the education to appropriately approve or reject access based on that person's day-to-day job function. Where we feel that there's room for improvement in this process is identifying the people that understand the impact of people having certain access assigned to their profiles. So whether that's at the line manager level, it's form part of that review, or if we include a sort of second phase or a second level of approval where it's a risk owner or a function owner, someone who's got that technical understanding that can make a more informed decision on, hang on, this person does not need to perform these day-to-day activities due to X, Y, and Z reasons. These people, from a risk perspective, are in a better position to make those decisions. Now, what we've also seen is some organizations try and tackle the user access reviews by focusing on all access assigned to their users. That is obviously an ideal scenario to continuously monitor the access, but again, it's an extremely time-consuming exercise. So what we've typically found is there are many instances where organizations who only focus on access that is risk-bearing, so again, pointing back to your rule sets, by focusing on your risk-bearing access, not only does it reduce the scope of the exercise to make the review set a bit more streamlined, but you're also then focusing on access that is potentially sensitive to your organization. So that is something that can be addressed from a process perspective. And lastly, I think this is a very common item across the SAP landscape is, in many instances, the review set or the user access reviews is typically a tick box exercise. It just becomes a formality of it needs to be done for audit or compliance perspectives, and someone just downloads a spreadsheet and says, yes, 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 I'm happy with this. So there's no actual accountability or responsibility that's taken by the people that have been identified in this process. So if you can streamline your user access review process to put the policies and procedures in place as to the expectations of the outcome, that can streamline the process for user access reviews, as an example. If we look at an example maybe from a design perspective, is we've often seen many organizations have a very complex role design. So from a design perspective, what we often find is many organizations have complex SAP role designs. So risks that are inherent to roles, it makes it very difficult to remediate this access to various challenges, such as the size of the roles. So in many instances, a roles of least privilege term is something that clients would typically try and achieve. But if your roles have been built with many transaction codes or Fury services that have been assigned, it poses challenges to remediate that access. We then look at the number of users that are potentially assigned to these roles, so over allocation of access, and ultimately transaction or user activity details should form a part of the design. Right. So the last item on the design is also looking at a clear mapping between our roles and the business process or all the functions. Right. So again, that also leads to your rule set being the foundation to make your informed decisions is on your role design. The rule set, we feel, is a critical step or a cornerstone in your user access review process. Elevated rights or firefighter, any sort of activity or aspect of SAP, your rule set is a key foundation block. So what we then took from this client, if we look at some key lessons, is even if you've got the right people identified for the relevant process, a poor role design and a lack of access risk ownership leads to ineffective controls and ultimately adverse audit findings.
So, thank you for that, Cameron. I think the points you raised there. It's because it is also if it ultimately becomes too complex for those end users to perform, either due to the role design or to the amount of data that they are responsible for reviewing. And at the end of the day, they, as you said, it becomes a tick box exercise just purely because of the volume and the complexity. So it is a case of how do we enable those users to best perform their activities, and that could be, by having friendlier roles, maybe dividing that review into separate portions, that it is more easily, I want to say, digested by the users that are responsible for it. If we now look at also some other processes, there are many different types of access risk management activities that also has a touch point with our business users. So I think let's maybe look at the elevated rights review or firefighter log review. So often a business user is required to validate the review or perform the review of what the firefighter user did during a specific firefighter session, but that become quite technical. So what would you suggest to a customer if they need to implement a process for elevated rights reviews? What would you suggest they do?
Yeah. So my personal opinion, and I think there's sort of three factors that I would like to focus on when it comes to emergency access. The first one is the allotted time that the access is allowed for. We've seen some organizations where there's open or open-ended access to emergency rights, which again comes back to adverse audit findings. So there need to be stringent time frames assigned to your emergency access. Maybe, for example, saying each emergency access session is allowed to be used for a maximum of 24 hours. And then that's when that particular access is revoked at that 24-hour period. So that is a key factor for emergency access, is focusing on the time allotted to each emergency access checkout. The next step is obviously around the activity logs. Now, it's one thing in assigning the access for an interim period of time, but the key factor is obviously monitoring and understanding what activities took place during that particular firefighter session. However, I would like to go into a little bit more detail around the activity logs. It should not just be a case of a transaction start or a Fury service that was executed. It should go to a bit more of a granular detail to look at any change documents that took place, to understand what changes were made in your SAP system, and do they actually match back to the source documentation as to why that particular emergency access was required. Obviously, if there's any gaps in that process, we would want to understand why certain processes were completed if they don't match back to the reasons. However, the challenge around the activity logs that we found often is, again, it's around the business education. So is identifying who are the appropriate people to review these logs. And that is probably the biggest challenge that I've experienced with emergency access, is identifying those people. We all understand that SAP is extremely technical, and not everybody understands our different transactions, Fury services, and the change object levels. So your CDHDO and CDPOS data, for example. What we've found that possibly is the best workaround is the concept of a peer review. So if I use the process from a basis perspective, obviously basis is very technical. You can't expect a business user to necessarily understand what activities were performed from a basis perspective. In those scenarios, one of the best options, in my opinion, is you'll have your basis review consultants or team members that will be set up for a peer review to obviously monitor what each consultant is performing during their emergency access. So that, I think, is something that can assist companies in those particular challenges. Right, so full audit log is something that we definitely recommend. And where the technology side comes in on these activity logs is, if it's a manual process, it's extremely time consuming. People don't necessarily understand all the data that they need to look for in SAP, where to find this data. And if you've got sufficient technology that can sort of build these workflows for you and fully automate the process, that is obviously a big tick box that it saves a lot of time. It builds in these different process flows, all the data is available to you, and ultimately it's there for your audit trail. So that obviously will come into play from an audit perspective. I think the last item that I want to touch on from an emergency access perspective is also, again, going back to your rule sets. Now, if you've got an accurate and up-to-date rule set, it makes the review of those activity logs more efficient. Now, the reason why I say that is, I'm sure we all understand with elevated rights or emergency access, there are potentially thousands of records to review. If there's been mass changes in the system, those change log records can grow exponentially. Now, if your rule set is up to date and accurate, you can then filter through that data a lot easier by focusing on access that is or transactions, theory services that are in your rule set, instead of going through 1,000 line items where there might only be 5 or 6 of those entries which are actually sensitive in nature. So that, I feel, is something that can facilitate an easier review of your emergency access, because if someone wants to review 1,000 line items, it's obviously potentially another tick box exercise. It just becomes a formality, and we're trying to remove that aspect and make it a bit more of an informed, engaging process to ensure that those reviews are actually being done as accurately as possible. So yeah, maybe again, just to summarize a few key lessons on emergency access setup. One of them is being the timing that it takes to, or the time allotted to your emergency access, the review of those logs, and then ensuring that there is sufficient training of your peer reviews, and ultimately an accurate rule set.
Yeah, thank you, Cameron. I think the technology part is very important, because I think everyone appreciates the complexity of SAP, and then to also perform a lot of that manually, that is where I think companies that do try to do it manually struggle then with that ownership. Is how can you realistically expect someone to review that amount of data, that level of complexity, without having a tool or a solution that can facilitate the process?
Correct. And maybe,
But-
sorry, just to jump in and add to that, Emile, touching on the technology is, a lot of times, along with the review of the activities, you also need to review that in a timely manner. So if a manual review is taking a company 1 month to perform, that's not really an effective review from an emergency access process. So again, your technology performing that function of generating all the activity logs on your behalf, provided in a centralized location, should be a critical thought process in your decision making around emergency access.
Yeah. So last thing I'll maybe touch on from the technology perspective around the elevated rights or firefighter process is just that companies should understand that not all technology presents the data in the same way. So if you want your business users to take ownership of some of that, the solution that you're using must be able to present the data in a way that it will enable them to perform those activities. Otherwise, you will end up with a scenario where someone will take a week or a month to review it, because it's so complex that it still requires a lot of manual review and analysis outside of the application that you're using. So moving on from the elevated rights process, one of the main items that companies focus on from an access risk management perspective is access requests. So access request has many different components and different types of requests, but it also has a touch point with business. So business users, like the line managers or role owners, are often required to perform a review and give their approval for a specific access request. So whether that is a role to a user assignment, new user creations, role content changes, etc. So Cameron, if you can just speak a bit about the use maybe then of technology in the use of the access request process. And we can also maybe speak just about the process a bit on what would be a good process to define to make sure that we get, first of all, the correct people and a quality control in place to perform that review.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a key item to consider when you are looking for technology to report on your SAP access risk is, if you're wanting to move it away from sort of IT owning that space to be more business centric, I feel that you need to have a solution that lends itself to business friendly understanding interpretation. So whether that's through the case of easy on the eye looking dashboards, or a user access request process that is easy and simple to set up, but also the data that is displayed is understandable to the business end user. So what we've often seen before is someone will set up an access request. It will workflow through to the line manager, and they'll probably just say yes, approve, because the users asked for the access. But the technology should be indicating what is the risk associated with that particular access request. So we don't necessarily want to be making blind approvals and then addressing risks when the audit comes around on an annual basis. So your technology should ultimately have an easy process to set up the workflow with the various approval steps. So if it means that the line manager is the first person in that approval process to then make a decision on yes or no. However, if they don't have that technical understanding of the risks that are introduced, the risk IDs might be complicated, role names are not necessarily descriptive enough. We then encourage clients to consider a 2-layer approval step. So yes, the line manager can accept that at the base level, this person does need the access. However, from a risk owner perspective or a role owner, someone else ultimately should take responsibility to understand, are there any risks associated with that particular role or access request? And if yes, is that appropriate to be assigned to the users in question? So a lot of it boils down to that business or user education, but your technology should then lend itself to make it a sort of easier process to train up those responsible parties in your access request process or user access review, any process basically that relates to provisioning of data to SAP. Now, with your technology, not only is there a risk component, but as I'm sure most people are aware, there's also been a change of how SAP are now measuring their user licenses. So those that are familiar with the STAR rule set, or how SAP are going to be reporting on licenses with S4 or RISE for SAP, is now down to the object and activity level. Now, if your technology is not providing you insights into what would the potential increase or decrease be from a user license classification perspective, that can also pose a challenge. Now, I know for today we may be speaking more towards SAP Access Risk, but I think this topic will, if it's not already a hot topic, it's going to come about in the near future, is technology should also provide the risk impact in combination with potential license costs that might be implicated with that particular role request. So that, for me, I think are the key items to consider around your technology for your user access request process. So maybe if I look at some of the key lessons that we've seen with recent challenges at clients, is number one, not having either any software in the landscape, or not having software or technology that presented the risk or the technical information of the risk in a business-friendly manner. That is a huge challenge, because you immediately get kicked back from business. I'm not going to get involved with this. It's not my area of responsibility. Send it back to IT. They can decide on whether the access is appropriate or not. The license implications is going to be a decisive factor when it comes to deciding on your technology, to have that visibility on potential increases in your license costs. And then ultimately ensuring that you have routed your approvals or the approval steps for these access requests, that needs to be set up correctly to ensure that the right people are in position to make those decisions on whether the access should or should not be assigned to your users.
Thank you very much. Maybe just in a quick summary, we've discussed just reviewing of segregation of duty, critical transaction risks, identifying the correct people. I think that's critical, but also making sure that if you've identified the correct people, that they understand the risks that they are responsible for, that they understand the impact, the likelihood of that happening, so that they can make an informed decision on when that happens, and also have maybe a global perspective on what that risk means for the organization. We then also touch not only on the people, but also the process design and technology, and how that plays a big part in the elevated rights process, for instance, the user access review. A couple of great points there, potentially about how do we make it simpler for that business user to perform their activities, potentially making some adjustments to the role design, so it's easier for the users to understand what access is contained within a role. so that it facilitates easy decision making. And then lastly, we talked about the technology. How does the technology come into it to facilitate basically every review that the business user is responsible for? So all of those touch points that business have. And then I think what you emphasized there at the end about the licensing is a great point. It will have a financial impact on an organization, and especially if I know it's going to result in as a financial implication, to my business unit or to my cost center that I'm responsible for, I would want to know that, and potentially that affects my decision on whether I'm approving or rejecting a specific access request. And that visibility is not something that a lot of business users have at the moment. So, Cameron, thank you very much for your time. I think this was great, and I think it will be very helpful for companies to understand how they can involve their business users going forward and how to improve the process. So to all the listeners, if you want to discuss any of these things in a bit more detail, welcome to reach out to us, and we hope to see you in the next one. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks for having me, Emile. Thank you.